The air in Camp Algona, Iowa, on a cold morning in late 1944, carried an almost unbelievable scent for a prisoner of war: fresh baking bread. For the German soldiers of the Afrika Korps held there, it was a daily, bewildering comfort. Inside the mess hall, the tables were laden with trays of scrambled eggs, thick-cut bacon, and pitchers of fresh milk. It was a breakfast that would have been the envy of a civilian in bombed-out Berlin, let alone a soldier on the front lines. This was captivity, American style. Half a world away, in the frigid confines of the Naoetsu prison camp in northern Japan, another scent filled the air: the thin, sour odor of watery barley soup, its surface shimmering with a few flecks of fish scale. For U.S. Marine Corps Major Greg Pappy Boyington, a captive there, breakfast was a lump of boiled grain, barely the size of a fist. This was captivity, Japanese style. One plate held sustenance, the other, slow starvation. This is not merely a story of food, but a tale of two philosophies locked in a global conflict. It is the story of how a nation's adherence to, or contempt for, a set of internationally agreed-upon rules could be measured in the most fundamental unit of human survival, the calorie. The 4,000 calories afforded to a German prisoner in America versus the 600 given to an Allied captive in Japan was not an accident of logistics. It was a deliberate, calculated outcome of military doctrine, national ideology, and the very definition of honor and surrender. The abyss between these two realities is captured with harrowing clarity in the accounts of those who endured the Japanese camps. Louis Zamperini, the Olympic runner whose B-24 crashed into the Pacific, survived 47 days on a raft, only to be plunged into a hell of institutionalized cruelty. In his memoir, Devil at My Heels, he describes the rations at the Ofuna interrogation center, which served as a gateway to the larger POW system. A typical day's food consisted of a small bowl of broth and a teacup of rice. The hunger was a physical entity, a constant, gnawing presence. He wrote, "Hunger was a cancer that was slowly eating me away. It began to consume my thoughts. I could not think of anything else." The guards used food as a weapon of absolute control. A minor infraction, or no infraction at all, could mean the loss of that meager teacup of rice. The result was a rapid, horrifying physical decline. Men wasted away, their bodies succumbing to diseases born of malnutrition. Beriberi, a vitamin B1 deficiency, caused painful swelling and eventual heart failure. Pellagra covered their skin in sores. Dysentery swept through the barracks, leaving men too weak to stand. The daily calorie count hovered between 600 and 700, a slow-motion death sentence. It was a diet scientifically calculated for emaciation, designed not just to weaken the body, but to break the spirit, to erase the individual and replace him with a desperate, animalistic craving for a single extra grain of rice. Contrast this with the testimony of Georg Gertner, a German sergeant captured in Tunisia in 1943. Sent to Camp Daming, New Mexico, Gertner's initial experience of captivity was one of profound shock. Expecting barbed wire and brutality, he found a system of methodical, almost bureaucratic, fairness. The food, he would later recount, was beyond anything he could have imagined. In his memoir, Hitler's Last Soldier in America, he described his first meal: roast pork, potatoes, gravy, green beans, and white bread with butter. For dessert, there was cake and coffee with real sugar. The prisoners were stunned into silence. They were being fed according to the precise stipulations of the Geneva Convention, which mandated that prisoners of war be given rations equivalent in quality and quantity to those of the detaining power's own depot troops. For the well-supplied American army, this meant a diet rich in calories, vitamins, and protein. German POWs were regularly served meat, dairy, and fresh produce. In some camps, especially those in agricultural regions, prisoners were even given access to camp farms, supplementing their already generous rations. The calorie counts were not just adequate, they were substantial, often exceeding 3,000, 500 and sometimes reaching 4,000, particularly for prisoners engaged in labor. This wasn't kindness, it was policy. It was the cold, logical application of a set of rules the United States had sworn to uphold. The difference between the two plates was forged in the vast impersonal machinery of national logistics and military law. The American approach was dictated by the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, an organization obsessed with statistics and supply chains. Army Service Forces Circular No. 232, issued in 1943, laid out in painstaking detail the nutritional requirements for enemy prisoners. It specified ounces of meat, pounds of flour, and even the allocation of condiments and spices. The system was designed to be abuse-proof, a top-down mandate that ensured a German prisoner in Texas received the same baseline nutrition as one in Wisconsin. This industrial-scale adherence to the rules was a projection of American power, the ability not only to fight a global war, but to feed millions of its own soldiers and hundreds of thousands of its captured enemies. The Japanese system, conversely, was a study in logistical collapse and doctrinal contempt. The Imperial Japanese Army's supply lines were perpetually strained, and by 1944 they were severed. There was often not enough food for their own frontline soldiers, who were expected to endure on spiritual strength or seishin. Prisoners of war were at the absolute bottom of this crumbling pyramid of priority. There was no centralized Quartermaster Corps ensuring their welfare. There was only the whim of the local camp commandant and a prevailing military culture that viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace. A soldier who surrendered had, in their eyes, forfeited his honor and, by extension, his humanity. His right to food was not enshrined in any code. It was a privilege that could be, and almost always was, revoked. Therefore, the two plates represented far more than just a meal. One was the product of a nation that saw the law as a universal principle to be upheld, even for its enemies. The other was the product of a nation whose wartime ideology placed honor above life and viewed compassion for a defeated foe as a weakness. The emaciated body of the Allied POW and the well-fed physique of the German POW were not accidents of war. They were the direct, physical manifestations of two irreconcilable worldviews. Understanding how these philosophies were codified into international law, and why one nation chose to follow that law while the other rejected it, is to understand the very foundation of the rules of modern warfare. The vast and horrifying chasm that separated the German POW's plate from the Allied POW's bowl was not dug by the war itself. It was engineered years earlier, in the quiet, chandeliered halls of Geneva, Switzerland, and in the stark, formal offices of the Japanese Ministry of War. The treatment of prisoners in the Second World War was a direct result of promises made and promises broken, of a legal framework embraced by one set of powers and scorned by another. At the heart of this divergence was the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war of 1929. Born from the collective trauma of the First World War, where millions of prisoners had perished from neglect, starvation, and disease, the 1929 Convention was an audacious attempt to impose the rule of law onto the chaos of the battlefield. It was a gentleman's agreement on a global scale, a document built on the optimistic belief that even in total war, a shared humanity could be preserved. It contained 97 articles dictating, in meticulous detail, every facet of a prisoner's life. The standards for their housing, the nature of their labor, their right to correspond with family, and most critically, the quantity and quality of their food. For the United States, adherence to this convention was a cornerstone of its war policy. This was a decision driven by a mixture of genuine humanitarianism, a deep-seated respect for legalism, and cold, calculated pragmatism. Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, a lawyer by trade and a statesman by temperament, saw the Geneva Convention not as an inconvenience but as an instrument of national security. The official American policy was rooted in the principle of reciprocity. Meticulous care for Axis prisoners on American soil was the best guarantee that American soldiers captured abroad would receive humane treatment in return. The War Department issued endless directives to camp commanders, reminding them that any deviation from the Convention's articles could have dire consequences for their own men overseas. This commitment was broadcast to the world. In a 1943 address, Stimson stated the American position unequivocally. "We are abiding, not only by the letter, but by the spirit of the Geneva Convention. We are doing this not only for humanitarian reasons, but for the practical reason of protecting our own men." This created a powerful bureaucratic momentum. The American war machine, once pointed in a direction, moved with relentless efficiency. If the rulebook said a prisoner was entitled to 3,400 calories a day, then the Quartermaster Corps would devise a supply chain to deliver 3,400 calories, plus a margin for error. The system was designed to be impersonal, a machine of fairness that protected the prisoner from the potential malice of his individual captors. Japan's relationship with the Convention was tragically different. It was a study in ambiguity and outright rejection, rooted in a military culture that was fundamentally incompatible with the Western concept of surrender. In 1929, Japan's diplomats had been present in Geneva. They had signed the convention, signaling their intent to comply. However, the crucial next step, ratification by the government, the act that would make the treaty legally binding, never happened. The Japanese military leadership, increasingly dominant in the 1932, saw the convention as a Western construct, an affront to the warrior's code of Bushido. This resistance was formally codified in 1941 with the issuance of the Senjinkun, or Instructions for the Battlefield, a military field code personally issued by then Minister of War Hideki Tojo. The Senjinkun was distributed to every soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army. Its most famous and fateful passage read, "Do not live to experience the shame of capture." This was not a suggestion. It was a sacred command. Surrender was not a strategic option. It was a spiritual failure, a betrayal of the emperor, family, and nation. A soldier who surrendered was considered dead to his community, his name struck from village records. This doctrine created a fatal paradox. If your own soldiers were forbidden from surrendering, how could you develop a coherent or humane policy for handling enemy soldiers who did? The answer was, you couldn't. The non-ratification of the Geneva Convention became a convenient legal shield, allowing Japan to claim it was not bound by the treaty's specifics, even as it assured the International Red Cross it would abide by its spirit. It was a promise that would prove to be catastrophically empty. The philosophical gulf is laid bare when the documents themselves are compared. Article 11 of the Geneva Convention is a model of legal precision. The food ration of prisoners of war shall be equivalent in quantity and quality to that of the depot troops of the detaining power. It is a measurable, verifiable standard. An inspector could, in theory, take a sample from the POW mess hall and a sample from the American supply depot and compare them. It is a clause written by lawyers. The Senjinkun, by contrast, speaks a language of pure spirit and sacrifice. It speaks of imperturbable resolve and exalting the imperial way. It contains no articles on the administrative handling of prisoners, no guidelines for their caloric intake. It is a document written by zealots. This contrast was the source of the entire tragedy. The American camp commandant had a rulebook filled with specifics to which he was legally bound. His Japanese counterpart had a creed that told him his prisoners were cowards who had forfeited their right to exist. One system was built on a foundation of rights and regulations, the other on a foundation of honor and shame. When faced with the logistical strains of war, the American system was mandated to find a way to feed its prisoners properly. The Japanese system had no such mandate. Prisoners were a burden, an afterthought in a supply chain already failing to feed its own armies. Ultimately, the fate of a prisoner of war in World War II was determined long before he was captured. It was determined by these foundational decisions: made in the 1,920 seconds and 30 seconds. The choice by the United States to ratify and rigorously implement the Geneva Convention meant that a German prisoner in Iowa could expect a meal planned by nutritionists and mandated by law. Japan's failure to ratify, coupled with the fanatical ideology of the Senjinkun, meant that an American prisoner in Japan could expect nothing more than a bowl of watery soup, his survival dependent not on law but on the whim of his captors and the crumbling logistics of a failing empire. The stage was set for two vastly different systems of captivity to be built, one based on bureaucratic over-engineering, the other on institutionalized neglect. The American response to the unexpected arrival of nearly 500,000 enemy prisoners on its shores was not improvisation. It was a vast and unprecedented exercise in industrial engineering. Faced with a logistical problem of staggering scale, the War Department did what the American system was uniquely designed to do. It built a solution from scratch, at speed, and with overwhelming resources. Between 1,942 and 1,945, over 500 prisoner-of-war camps were constructed across the United States, from the forests of Maine to the deserts of Arizona. These were not makeshift stockades. They were standardized, mass-produced cities, each built to a precise blueprint dictated from Washington. The program was a testament to a uniquely American philosophy that any problem, even one as complex and fraught as human captivity, could be solved with proper management, meticulous regulation, and a relentless application of logistical might. The system was designed to be a machine, and its primary fuel was the Geneva Convention. The chief architect of this machine was Colonel B.M. Bryan, the Assistant Provost Marshal General. Bryan was not a combat officer. He was a master bureaucrat, a man who understood that in a system of this size, the greatest enemy was not rebellion, but inconsistency. He and his office waged a relentless war against deviation from the rules. They blanketed the camp network with a blizzard of circulars, memoranda, and directives, each one clarifying another minute detail of the Geneva Convention. Inspectors from the Provost Marshal General's office, along with delegates from the International Red Cross and the Swiss legation, the official protecting power for German interests, were a constant presence. These inspections were famously thorough. An inspector might demand to see the records for the camp's canteen, ensuring profits were being used for the prisoners' welfare as mandated. He might take a core sample of the stew being served for dinner to send back to a lab for nutritional analysis. The goal, as Bryan saw it, was to create a system so rigid and so heavily monitored that it was virtually immune to the personal prejudices of any individual camp commander or guard. In a report to the Chief of Staff, Bryan outlined this philosophy, stating the objective was to operate prisoner-of-war camps in such a manner as to preclude any justifiable charge of violation of the Geneva Convention. It was a legalistic, almost clinical approach to a human problem, and it was ruthlessly effective. The result of this top-down obsession with regulation was a profound and uniform sense of disbelief among the arriving German prisoners. They had been indoctrinated by Goebbels' propaganda to expect brutal retribution, to believe that capture by the Americans meant slave labor and starvation. Instead, they found a world of bewildering order and astonishing plenty. Luftwaffe fighter ace Franz von Vera, captured after being shot down over Britain in 1940 and briefly held in Canada before his famous escape, was one of the first to document this shock. In his initial interrogations, he was offered cigarettes and treated with a disarming professionalism. The journey to the camp was on a passenger train, not a cattle car. The camp itself, with its new barracks, hot showers, and organized recreational facilities, felt less like a prison and more like a Spartan military base. The most jarring element was the food. It was predictable, plentiful, and of high quality. This experience was replicated hundreds of thousands of times over. Men who had been starving in the final days of the Tunisian campaign or freezing on the Eastern Front found themselves in a system where 3 meals a day were a guaranteed, non-negotiable reality. This wasn't a matter of American generosity. It was a matter of policy. The system was designed to deliver a specific, mandated outcome, and the prisoner's initial shock was merely the first byproduct of its efficient operation. The physical construction of this system was a direct reflection of America's industrial power. A typical large camp, like Camp Hearn in Texas, designed to hold nearly 5,000 prisoners, was a monumental undertaking. It consumed over 25 million board feet of lumber, 3,500 kegs of nails, and 1,500 gallons of paint. Its water and sewage systems were engineered to the standards of a small American city. The logistical tail required to sustain such a place was immense. Every single day, a train of supply trucks would arrive at the gates, their contents dictated by Quartermaster Corps spreadsheets. If the regulations called for each prisoner to receive 4 ounces of meat per day, then a camp of 4,800 prisoners required the daily delivery and refrigeration of 1,200 pounds of beef, pork, or chicken. Bakeries, often staffed by German POWs who were professional bakers, churned out thousands of loaves of fresh bread daily. The supply chain was a miniature version of the one sustaining the entire US war effort, drawing from the vast agricultural and industrial heartland. Meat came from the stockyards of Chicago, vegetables from the fields of California, and flour from the grain elevators of Kansas. Every calorie consumed by a German prisoner in Texas was a testament to the fact that the United States could project its logistical power not only across oceans to the front lines, but also deep into its own interior to run a prison system of unparalleled scale. In the end, the American POW system was not about morality in the abstract sense. It was about process. It treated the care and feeding of its captives as an industrial problem to be solved, not a human dilemma to be agonized over. The machine was built to be efficient, predictable, and legally defensible. It was over-engineered by design, with layers of redundancy and inspection to ensure the mandated outputs, humane treatment, and adherence to the convention were consistently achieved. This cold, bureaucratic efficiency, this transformation of a legal document into a functioning, continental-scale supply chain, was in many ways a more profound expression of American power than any single battlefield victory. It demonstrated a nation so rich in resources and so confident in its systems that it could afford to feed its enemies better than most of them had ever been fed in their own armies. The 5 a.m. whistle at Camp Algona cut through the Iowa frost with industrial precision. In the long, timber-framed barracks, German prisoners of war stirred, the routine now a familiar, almost comforting rhythm. For men who had spent years conditioned by the chaotic violence of the front, this predictability was a form of psychological balm. But the true source of their daily astonishment was not the order, but the aroma that began to drift from the mess halls, roasting meat, brewing coffee, and baking bread. It was the smell of a life they thought had vanished forever. Inside, the scene was one of standardized plenty. On the breakfast line, a soldier who months earlier had been scavenging for frozen potatoes in the Ardennes was handed a tray holding 2 fried eggs, 3 strips of bacon, a bowl of oatmeal with milk and sugar, and 2 thick slices of white bread with a pat of butter. This was not a feast for a special occasion. This was Tuesday. This was the relentless, methodical reality of the 4,000-calorie diet. The letters sent home by German POWs, heavily censored by American authorities, became artifacts of disbelief for their families in the collapsing Reich. A soldier named Matthias Tolle, writing from a camp in the Midwest, tried to describe the food to his wife. He spoke of meat nearly every day and white bread, as much as we want. He mentioned coffee with real sugar, a luxury unimaginable in civilian Germany, where ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns was the norm. The most unbelievable reports were of items like ice cream, served on hot days, or the steady supply of fresh fruit. These details were often met with suspicion by the German censors on the receiving end. They were assumed to be coded messages or blatant propaganda. The truth was too fantastic to be believed. For the prisoners themselves, the experience was profoundly disorienting. Every meal was a direct, tangible contradiction of everything Joseph Goebbels had told them about the decadent, starving American plutocracy. Their own leaders had promised them glory and delivered starvation. Their enemies had promised them nothing and delivered steak. This cognitive dissonance, served 3 times a day, became a powerful, unspoken tool of denazification. This abundance, however, was not viewed with universal approval by the Americans outside the wire. In towns like Algona, the civilian population was living under a strict wartime rationing system. Homemakers planned meals around their limited allotments of meat, sugar, and gasoline, all tracked with government-issued coupon books. The local newspaper, the Algona Upper Des Moines, occasionally published articles that hinted at the simmering resentment. Citizens saw truckloads of fresh produce and sides of beef being delivered to the camp and knew that the prisoners were eating better than they were. A guard at a camp in Texas, in a post-war interview, recalled the tension. "We had folks driving by the camp, yelling at us for coddling the Nazis," he remembered. "I had to explain that my orders came from the top, that this was about the Geneva Convention. But it's hard to explain international law to a farmer who can't get enough butter for his own family's table." This created a strange internal conflict within the American system. The military's strict adherence to international treaty and industrial-scale supply versus the civilian population's perception of unfairness. The policy was designed for an international audience and for the protection of American POWs abroad, not for the approval of the local taxpayers who were footing the bill and tightening their own belts. The statistical reality of the POW diet is where the scale of the American logistical achievement becomes clear. A sample daily menu, pulled from the records of the Provost Marshal General's office, quantifies the experience. Breakfast, as described, would total approximately 900 calories. Lunch was often the main meal for prisoners engaged in labor contracts on local farms, a thick beef stew packed with potatoes and vegetables, more bread, and an apple, easily topping 1,200 calories. Dinner would be another substantial meal, perhaps roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, a green vegetable, and another 2 slices of bread, followed by a simple dessert like canned peaches or a piece of gingerbread, adding another 1,500 calories. The total consistently fell between 3,600 and 4,200 calories. The most damning statistic, when viewed from the civilian perspective, was the meat ration. Army regulations stipulated that a prisoner of war receive a minimum of 28 ounces of meat per week. At the same time, the ration for an adult American civilian, set by the Office of Price Administration, fluctuated, but was often as low as 12 to 16 ounces per week. The men who had fought for the Third Reich were, by law, being given double the meat ration of the American citizens who were guarding them. This daily reality of well-fed captivity worked a slow, inexorable change on the prisoners' worldview. It did more than just sustain their bodies. It systematically dismantled the ideological scaffolding of the Nazi regime. The propaganda images of a weak, inefficient America crumbled in the face of such overwhelming casual abundance. The idea of a master race was difficult to sustain when your captors demonstrated a capacity for organization and a commitment to principle that your own government had utterly failed to provide. The 4,000 calories were not just nutrition, they were a weapon of ideas, a quiet but relentless argument for a different way of ordering the world. For the German prisoner, each meal was a lesson in the power of an industrialized democracy, a lesson that would have profound implications when it came time for them to return to a defeated and starving homeland. But half a world away, another group of prisoners was learning a far more brutal lesson, one taught not with calories, but with their deliberate and systematic removal. The systematic starvation in Japanese prison camps was not the product of simple logistical failure or the random sadism of individual guards. It was the calculated, predictable outcome of a national ideology, a state-enforced spiritual doctrine that held the act of surrender in absolute contempt. To understand the 600-calorie bowl of rice, one must first understand the worldview that created it. This worldview was not an ancient, immutable code of the samurai. It was a modern, radical reinterpretation of Bushido, weaponized for 20th century total war. Its Bible was a small, pocket-sized booklet issued to every Japanese soldier, the Senjinkun, the instructions for the battlefield. This was the document that philosophically justified the horrors to come. Issued in January 1941 by the authority of Army Minister Hideki Tojo, the Senjinkun was designed to forge a new kind of soldier, one for whom death was infinitely preferable to dishonor. Its text was a mixture of spiritual exhortation and brutal command, but its most fateful and influential passage was a single, unambiguous line that sealed the fate of millions. It read, "Never be taken prisoner alive, but rather die and leave behind a name that will be honored for generations." This was not poetic advice, it was a direct order. The booklet went further, framing capture as a corrupting, defiling act. A sublime sense of self-sacrifice must guide you throughout life and death. Do not think of your life. Do not think of your reputation. Do not expect to return home alive. By this logic, a soldier's duty was to become a human projectile, to be expended for the emperor. Surrender was a malfunction, a rejection of this sacred purpose. The Senjinkun effectively stripped the Japanese soldier of the right to be captured, and in doing so, it erased any conceptual framework for treating a captured enemy with humanity. This doctrine was not merely an abstract ideal, it was brutally enforced by a culture of intense social and psychological pressure. The diaries and post-war testimonies of Japanese soldiers reveal a world where the fear of shame was more potent than the fear of death. A soldier going into battle knew that his family's honor was inextricably tied to his willingness to die. If he were to be captured, a notice from the government would arrive at his family home. It would not say he was a prisoner of war, it would say he had died in battle. His name would be removed from the town records, a funeral would be held. To his community, he would cease to exist. To return home after the war as a former prisoner was to return as a ghost, a source of unbearable shame for his entire family. In their landmark collection of oral histories, Japan at War, Haruko and Theodore Cook documented this profound pressure. One soldier recalled his training. "We were taught that to be taken prisoner was the ultimate disgrace. We were told that prisoners were tortured and killed anyway, so it was better to die fighting or by our own hand." This created a self-fulfilling prophecy of brutality, both on and off the battlefield. The enforcement of this ideology was absolute, managed by the dual hammers of propaganda and the Kempeitai, the dreaded military police. Propaganda relentlessly glorified the concept of gyokusai, literally shattering the jewel. This was the poetic term for annihilation, for a garrison fighting to the last man. The defenders of Attu Island in the Aleutians, who charged to their deaths in 1943, were held up as national heroes. Soldiers who committed suicide with grenades rather than surrender were celebrated in newspapers and films. Behind this wall of propaganda stood the Kempeitai, whose agents were present in every unit. They were tasked with enforcing ideological purity and absolute obedience. Any soldier who expressed unpatriotic thoughts, such as a desire to survive the war, could be subjected to brutal beatings or summary execution. This system ensured that the army's fanatical ethos was not just encouraged but violently imposed from within. The concept of a prisoner of war, a legal status protected by international law, simply had no place in this universe of compelled self-destruction. This entire ideological structure, the Senjinkun's command, the social pressure, the propaganda of honorable death produced the final, fatal logic that governed the camps. If a Japanese soldier who surrendered was a non-person, an object of shame who had forfeited his place in the human community, what then was an enemy soldier who had done the same? In the eyes of his captors, the Allied POW was not a soldier who had been honorably defeated in combat. He was a contemptible creature who had chosen life over duty. He had failed the most basic test of a warrior and, in doing so, had proven himself to be less than human. This was not a justification for cruelty invented after the fact. It was the foundational premise of the entire system. A creature without honor had no rights. He did not merit protection under the law, and he certainly did not merit a share of the empire's dwindling food supplies. His suffering was not a regrettable consequence of war. It was the natural and just outcome of his own moral failure. The 600-calorie diet was, in this twisted logic, precisely what such a dishonorable being deserved. The day at the Ofuna Naval Interrogation Center began not with a whistle, but with a bone-deep dampness that seeped up from the concrete floor. Before dawn, the air in the unheated cells was thick with the acrid stench of dysentery and the stale odor of unwashed bodies. For the Allied prisoners held there, many of them downed airmen or captured officers, this was a secret, illegal camp, a black site where the Geneva Convention did not exist even in theory. The morning ritual was the same. A guard would slide back the wooden slat on the cell door, and a small wooden bowl would be shoved through. Inside was the day's first meal, a substance the prisoners grimly called fank. It was a watery gruel, a few tablespoons of boiled barley or rice floating in a thin grey liquid. It was tepid, tasteless, and provided just enough energy to sustain the act of breathing for another few hours. This was the first installment of the 600-calorie diet, a meticulously administered ration of slow death. Richard Gordon, a British Royal Artillery captain captured at Singapore, kept a secret diary on scraps of paper, a chronicle that would become his memoir, Guest of the Emperor. His entries provide a clinical, almost obsessive accounting of the psychology of starvation. The constant, gnawing hunger became the central organizing principle of his existence. He wrote of the endless, circular conversations among the prisoners, all revolving around food. Men would spend hours describing, in painstaking detail, the meals their mothers used to cook. They would write down elaborate, imaginary menus for future feasts. Gordon noted how the mind, deprived of actual sustenance, began to feed on itself. He wrote, "We were living in a dream world of food. One became an expert on what one had not got. Our world was bounded by our stomachs." This was not just physical deprivation, it was a form of profound mental torture. The guards knew this and exploited it. They would sometimes describe their own meals in lavish detail to the starving men, or leave a half-eaten piece of fruit just outside a cell door, watching as the prisoners writhed in a torment of desperate craving. Greg "Pappy" Boyington, the hard-living ace of the Marine Black Sheep Squadron, was shot down in January 1944 and brought to Ofuna. His memoir, Black Sheep, recounts the experience with a brawler's fury. Boyington, a man of immense physical vitality, quickly understood that the starvation was not a byproduct of wartime shortages. It was a deliberate, calculated policy. He termed it scientific starvation. The goal, as he saw it, was to keep the prisoners alive, but only just. They were to be maintained in a state of perpetual weakness, their bodies too feeble to resist, their minds too clouded by hunger to mount a defense during interrogation. He described receiving his daily ration, a small ball of rice, and dividing it into 3 minuscule portions to be eaten over the course of the day, an attempt to trick his stomach into feeling full. Boyington saw guards use food as an instrument of direct control. A prisoner who showed the slightest sign of defiance would have his meager ration cut in half. A prisoner who was deemed cooperative might be rewarded with a single precious rice ball. The system turned food, the most basic human need, into the ultimate lever of power, reducing men of immense courage and skill to a state of desperate, childlike dependency. The medical reality of this diet was a predictable and horrifying cascade of bodily collapse. An average, sedentary adult male requires approximately 1,600 to 1,800 calories per day, simply to maintain basal metabolic function, the energy needed to keep the heart beating, the lungs breathing, and the brain working. The 600-calorie diet of the Japanese camps was less than half of this bare minimum. The body, forced into a state of extreme crisis, begins to consume itself. First, it burns through fat reserves. Then, it attacks the muscles, leading to severe atrophy. The prisoners became living skeletons, their skin stretched tight over their bones. This profound malnutrition opened the door to a host of agonizing diseases. Wet beriberi caused the body to swell with fluid, painfully bloating the legs and abdomen and eventually leading to congestive heart failure. Dry beriberi attacked the nervous system, causing paralysis and excruciating pain. Pellagra, a niacin deficiency, manifested in the 4Ds. Dermatitis, leaving the skin cracked and bleeding. Diarrhea, which further dehydrated and weakened the body. Dementia, as the brain was starved of essential nutrients. And finally, death. The prisoners of Ofuna were trapped in a real-time medical textbook on the terminal stages of starvation. The 600-calorie diet, therefore, was far more than a logistical failure. It was the primary weapon of dehumanization in the Japanese POW system. It was the practical application of the ideology outlined in the Senjinkun. By starving a man, you strip him of everything but his most primitive instinct, the need to eat. You erase his identity as a soldier, an officer, a husband, or a father. He becomes a creature of pure, desperate want. In the eyes of the Japanese captors, this process simply revealed the prisoner for what he already was, a contemptible being who had chosen life over honorable death. The starvation confirmed their prejudice. This physical and spiritual annihilation was the entire point of the exercise. But it was only made possible by a logistical and industrial reality that was the mirror opposite of the American system, a supply chain built on scarcity, feeding an army that was itself on the brink of starvation. The plate of food placed before a prisoner of war is the final, tangible output of a vast and largely invisible industrial machine. The stark difference between the 4,000-calorie American ration and the 600-calorie Japanese ration was not, at its core, a matter of battlefield ethics. It was a direct consequence of a head-on collision between two diametrically opposed logistical philosophies. On one side was the American system of centralized, data-driven surplus, an industrial hammer that overwhelmed problems with sheer material weight. On the other was the Japanese system of decentralized, scarcity-driven improvisation, a philosophy that prioritized fighting spirit over supply lines and ultimately collapsed under its own dysfunctional weight. The fate of the POW was sealed in the ledgers of quartermasters and the manifests of cargo ships, thousands of miles from any prison camp. The United States Army Quartermaster Corps was one of the largest and most complex business enterprises on the planet. It operated on a scale that dwarfed multinational corporations, and its approach to feeding prisoners was the same as its approach to feeding its own army. It was a scientific problem to be solved with data. The Corps developed a master menu, a meticulously planned nutritional blueprint designed to be implemented across the entire POW camp system. This was not a vague guideline. It was a set of precise specifications, detailing caloric, protein, and vitamin requirements. As laid out in its own operational manuals, the baseline for prisoner rations was the Army's Type B field ration, the standard food supply for troops in rear area depots. This single decision, mandated by the Geneva Convention, yoked the welfare of the German POW directly to the well-fed American GI. The supply chain was a marvel of integration. A procurement officer in Washington could place an order that would be transmitted to a meatpacking plant in Omaha, a cannery in California, and a flour mill in Minneapolis. The resulting products would converge at a regional depot and be trucked, on a predictable schedule, to Camp Algona. It was a system that treated food not as a morale factor, but as a strategic commodity to be managed, measured, and delivered with industrial precision. The logistical doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Army was the polar opposite. It was a system born of necessity and institutionalized by a warrior culture that was deeply contemptuous of the soft sciences of supply. As detailed by historians like F.A.C. Clancher in his searing analysis, Death by Logistics, the IJA's fundamental problem was its inability to sustain its own forces in the field. The official policy was often Genchi Chokatsu, or living off the land, While this worked in the fertile plains of China, it was a death sentence in the jungles of New Guinea or the barren volcanic rock of Iwo Jima. This was compounded by a rigid and fatalistic system of priority. When cargo space was available on the desperately scarce transport ships, ammunition and fuel always took precedence. Food was a distant third. The result was that Japanese soldiers themselves were often starving. It was not uncommon for frontline Japanese divisions to be on half rations or less. In this context, enemy prisoners were not just a low priority, they were a complete non-entity in the logistical calculus. There was no centralized Quartermaster Corps to advocate for their needs or a master menu to guarantee their nutrition. There was only a local commander, presiding over a dwindling pile of supplies, who saw the prisoners as just more mouths to feed from an already empty trough. The numbers behind these two systems tell the whole story. The American industrial base, protected by two oceans, went into overdrive. The United States launched over 5,000 Liberty and Victory ships during the war, creating a merchant marine so vast that it could absorb staggering losses and still increase its net carrying capacity. By 1945, the U.S. merchant fleet had a capacity of over 33 million gross tons. Japan, by contrast, started the war with a respectable 6 million tons. But this fleet was the primary target of American submarines. The Silent Service waged a devastatingly effective campaign, sinking over 8 million tons of Japanese shipping, more than they started with, despite their own frantic building programs. This meant the logistical pipeline to the American homeland was a fire hose, while the pipeline to the Japanese home islands was a leaky straw. A single large POW camp in the US would receive hundreds of tons of food supplies every month with the regularity of a commuter train. An entire Japanese army of 100,000 men fighting in the Philippines in late 1944 was lucky to receive a few thousand tons of supplies in total over a period of several months. The caloric number on a prisoner's plate was, therefore, the final, brutal answer to a complex industrial equation. It was the sum of a nation's steel production, its agricultural output, its shipbuilding capacity, and its bureaucratic efficiency. The American system was built on a foundation of such massive surplus that it could project its power not only to the front lines, but also to the mess halls of its enemies' captured soldiers. The Japanese system was built on a foundation of scarcity, forced to make impossible choices between bullets and rice, a choice that guaranteed starvation for its own soldiers and, by extension, a far worse fate for its prisoners. The difference between 4,000 and 600 calories had been decided in the shipyards of California and the steel mills of Pennsylvania long before the first shot was fired. The industrial machines of war and logistics delivered a verdict that was ultimately executed by the smallest and most intimate of mechanisms, the human cell. The true cost of the 600-calorie diet was not measured in tons of missing cargo, but in the microscopic breakdown of the body's essential processes. The diseases that scythed through the Japanese prison camps, beriberi, pellagra, dysentery, and a host of other afflictions, were not merely unfortunate consequences of wartime deprivation. They were the predictable, weaponized outcomes of a deliberate policy of nutritional warfare. The camp commandants did not need bullets to kill their prisoners. They had a far more efficient and agonizing weapon in the form of controlled starvation, which patiently turned each man's own biology into his personal executioner. Dr. Henry H.G. Hecking, a Dutch medical officer captured in Java and forced to work on the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, kept a secret record of this medical holocaust. His notes, buried in a bottle and recovered after the war, are a testament to a doctor's horrifying impotence in the face of state-sponsored disease. He clinically documented the two phases of beriberi, the thiamine deficiency that was the camp's signature plague. There was wet beriberi, where the body's circulatory system failed, causing grotesque swelling. Men's legs would bloat to the size of tree trunks, their scrotums swelling to the size of coconuts, their heart sacs filling with fluid until the organ simply gave up. Then there was dry beriberi, which attacked the nervous system. It began with a tingling in the toes, then a burning sensation, then creeping paralysis. Men would lose the ability to walk, their muscles withering away until they were completely helpless. Dr. Hecking described the agony of trying to treat these conditions with no vitamins, no medicine, and no food. He wrote of one patient, "His suffering is terrible. I can do nothing for him, absolutely nothing. This is the hardest of all for a doctor." His notes are a litany of men whose bodies were failing in precise, textbook ways, a perfectly engineered epidemic of malnutrition. While doctors like Hecking catalogued the body's decay, other survivors documented the concurrent collapse of the mind. Hunger, when it becomes the singular, dominant reality, systematically dismantles the human personality. E. Bartlett Kerr, an American officer who survived camps in the Philippines and Japan, chronicled this psychological erosion in his memoir, Surrender and Survival. He described how men who were once vibrant and complex individuals were reduced to a single, obsessive focus. Food. Personalities vanished, replaced by an apathetic, zombie-like state the prisoners called going Asiatic. Men would sit and stare into space for hours, devoid of emotion. Kerr wrote of the obsessive rituals that took hold. A man might hoard his single scoop of rice, spending an hour eating it grain by grain with a sliver of bamboo to prolong the experience. The social bonds that held men together dissolved. A prisoner might steal his comrade's meagre ration in the middle of the night, an act that would have been unthinkable months earlier but was now a simple matter of survival. Men became walking skeletons, not just in body, but in spirit, hollowed out by a craving so profound that it erased everything else. This devastating anecdotal evidence from the camps was given a chilling scientific confirmation years later, in a quiet laboratory in the American Midwest. From 1944 to 1945, a physiologist named Ansel Keys conducted the landmark Minnesota starvation experiment. Seeking to understand how to best refeed the starving populations of post-war Europe, Keys recruited 36 healthy, psychologically stable, conscientious objectors for a year-long study. For 6 months, the volunteers were placed on a semi-starvation diet of around 1,570 calories, more than double what most Allied POWs received. The results were catastrophic. These well-adjusted young men underwent a complete psychological disintegration. They became severely depressed and irritable. They experienced fits of hysteria and rage. Most tellingly, they became utterly obsessed with food. They read cookbooks voraciously. They planned imaginary meals. And they talked of nothing else, precisely mirroring the behavior described by Richard Gordon and E. Bartlett Kerr. Some suffered from edema, the same swelling that characterized wet beriberi. The experiment proved, in a controlled setting, that the psychological collapse seen in the POW camps was not a sign of individual weakness. It was the universal, predictable, and unavoidable human response to being starved. Starvation, then, was the perfect weapon for the Japanese camp system. It required no complex technology and very little effort. Its genius lay in its insidious ability to turn the prisoner's own body into the instrument of his torture. Every biological process, every desperate craving for energy, became a part of the punishment. The body consumed its own muscles, the mind consumed its own sanity. It broke the prisoner from the inside out, reducing him to a state that, in the eyes of his captors, simply confirmed his subhuman status. It was the ultimate expression of the Senjinkun's ideology, a slow, biological erasure of an enemy who had already been declared spiritually dead by the act of surrender. The barbed wire fence that encloses a prison camp creates a hermetically sealed world, a pressurized environment where human nature is stripped down to its essentials. But the wire does not eliminate conflict, it merely turns it inward. The primary struggle for a prisoner of war was often not with the guards in the towers, but with the men sleeping in the bunks beside them. Within these closed systems, a second, internal war was waged daily. In the American camps, this was a war of ideology, a bitter and often violent struggle between die-hard Nazis and those who had lost faith in the Reich. In the Japanese camps, where ideology had been rendered irrelevant by starvation, it was a far more primitive war, a desperate Hobbesian struggle for the next mouthful of food, where the bonds of comradeship were tested and often broken. Inside the well-fed world of the American POW system, a shadow government operated with ruthless efficiency. The American administrators provided food, shelter, and medical care, but they could not control the political pathologies the prisoners brought with them. As historian Arnold Kramer meticulously documented in his work, Nazi Prisoners of War in America, the most ardent National Socialists quickly seized control of the internal camp structure. They became the camp spokesmen, the barracks leaders, and the kitchen supervisors, positions that gave them immense power over their fellow prisoners. From this perch, they waged a relentless campaign of terror against any German soldier deemed un-German or defeatist. Secret kangaroo courts were held in the dead of night. Men suspected of cooperating with the Americans or simply expressing doubt about the Führer's ultimate victory were subjected to brutal beatings. In the most extreme cases, they were murdered. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, in November 1943, a group of Nazi enforcers lynched Corporal Johann Kunze, believing he was an informant. His body was found hanging in the barracks. Similar politically motivated murders occurred at other camps. The American authorities were often powerless to stop it, unable to penetrate the wall of silence maintained by the prisoners. For an anti-Nazi German soldier, the greatest danger was not the American guard with his rifle, but the true believer in his own ranks with his fanatical, murderous conviction. Half a world away, a different kind of internal conflict was consuming the prisoners of the Japanese. Ideology was a luxury that had long since been burned away by hunger. The war here was for a single calorie, a stolen potato, a dropped grain of rice. The rigid military discipline that had defined these men's lives disintegrated under the relentless pressure of starvation. Memoirs from the camps, like Australian journalist Rohan Rivett's Behind Bamboo, paint a grim picture of this societal collapse. Men formed small clandestine syndicates to orchestrate raids on the camp kitchen or to steal from the guards' meagre stores. Betrayal was common. A man might inform on another's hidden food cache in exchange for an extra ration from a guard. The traditional hierarchy of rank became a cruel joke. An officer, weakened by dysentery and beriberi, had little authority over an enlisted man who was physically stronger and more ruthless. The moral calculus of survival became agonizing. Would you steal food from a dying man's portion? Would you remain silent while a fellow prisoner was beaten to death for a crime you committed? These were not theoretical questions, they were daily realities. The struggle was not for the future of the fatherland, but for one's own next heartbeat. A comparative analysis of these two internal wars reveals the profound impact of the prisoners' material conditions on their social structures. In the American camps, the surplus of food and free time allowed for the luxury of politics. The imported Nazi hierarchy could flourish because the basic needs of its subjects were met. The enforcers could focus on ideological purity because they were not fighting for their next meal. Their violence was a tool to maintain a political order. The structure of the Third Reich was, in a strange and distorted way, recreated on American soil. In the Japanese camps, the exact opposite occurred. The extreme scarcity of resources obliterated complex social structures. The environment became atomized, every man for himself. The violence was not political, it was primal. It was the violence of desperation, a fight for the limited resources necessary for life. Rank, nationality, and even friendship became secondary to the biological imperative. The society that emerged was not a recreation of any pre-war order, but a regression to a more primitive state of existence. The prison wire, therefore, did not mark an end to the war for those who crossed it. It marked a transition to a new and often more insidious kind of conflict. The camps became social laboratories, crucibles that tested the limits of political fanaticism and the breaking point of human solidarity. Whether through the ideological terror of a Nazi enforcer in an Oklahoma barracks, or the desperate cunning of a starving man in a Thai jungle, the internal wars of the POWs were a grim testament to the fact that even when the guns fall silent, the struggle for power and survival continues with its own savage logic. The enemy was no longer a soldier in a different uniform. It was the man right next to you. The end of the war was not a single, universal event. It was a collision of profoundly different realities, a moment when the sealed, artificial worlds of the prison camps were violently breached, exposing their inhabitants to the shocking truths they had been shielded from. In August 1945, when the first American naval launch pulled up to the pier at the Omori POW camp in Tokyo Bay, the young officers on board were met with a sight from Dante's Inferno. Men, or what was left of them, staggered forward. They were living skeletons, their skin the colour of ash, their eyes sunk deep into their skulls, their limbs bloated from wet beriberi. The liberators, healthy and strong, recoiled in stunned horror, some openly weeping at the sight. In that same month, half a world away, a German sergeant being processed for repatriation out of a camp in Virginia stepped onto a scale and noted with a sense of detached pride that he had gained 15 pounds during his captivity. His liberation would come months later, when he was finally transported back to the ruins of Hamburg. There, stepping off the train, his eyes would not meet those of cheering crowds, but the hollow, accusing stares of starving German children, their bellies swollen from hunger edema, a sight that mirrored the very prisoners his American captors had just saved. The accounts of the American liberators are a chorus of disbelief and rage. The men of the 6th Ranger Battalion who executed the daring raid on the Cabanatuan camp in the Philippines in January 1945 were hardened combat veterans, but they were unprepared for what they found. Captain Robert Prince, a key planner of the raid, described the prisoners as walking ghosts. In his official report, he noted, "Many of them were suffering from malnutrition to the point that they were living skeletons. Their joy at being liberated was pathetic to see." The medical teams that followed the combat troops were overwhelmed. They found men weighing less than 100 pounds, their bodies covered in tropical ulcers, their minds often wandering from the psychological trauma of years of abuse and starvation. The liberators' first instinct was to give the starving men their own sea rations and chocolate bars, an act of compassion that doctors quickly had to stop. The medics knew that giving rich food to a body systematically starved for years could induce refeeding syndrome, a fatal shock to the system. The kindness of the liberator could, in a cruel paradox, be the final blow. The liberation of the German prisoner was a far more surreal and psychologically jarring experience. Reinhold Pabel, a former sergeant who had been held in America, described his return to a shattered Germany in his memoir. He and his fellow repatriated prisoners were well dressed in new clothes provided by the Americans and physically healthy. As their train pushed deeper into their homeland, they stared out the windows at a landscape of apocalyptic destruction. Cities they remembered as vibrant centers of life were now vast fields of rubble. The true shock came when they encountered their own people. Pabel wrote of seeing German women and children scavenging for scraps of food in the garbage bins outside the train station. He, who had felt mildly inconvenienced by the quality of the coffee in his American camp, was now confronted with a level of civilian starvation that rivaled what the Allies had found in Japanese camps. It was a moment of profound and sickening guilt. "We, the defeated soldiers," he wrote, "were returning as fat men to a starving nation." The propaganda of their own government was revealed as a monstrous lie, and the supposed cruelty of their captors was exposed as a disciplined, almost baffling form of humanity. They had been spared the war's final, horrific consequences, only to be dropped into the epicenter of its aftermath. The medical statistics from these two liberations quantify the abyss between them. The average American POW liberated from a Japanese camp had lost between 60 and 70 pounds from their pre-capture weight. It was common for a 6-foot-tall man to weigh 95 pounds. The immediate medical response was a desperate triage. The most critical cases were evacuated to hospital ships, where they were put on intravenous drips of plasma and protein hydrolysates, their systems too weak to even digest solid food. The mortality rate in the first few weeks after liberation remained tragically high. For the German POWs leaving the United States, the process was one of administrative discharge. They were given a final medical checkup, which often confirmed they were at or even above their induction weight. They were deloused, issued travel papers, and placed on ships for an orderly return. The American military's problem was not how to save them from starvation, but how to process the paperwork for nearly 400,000 healthy men in an efficient manner. Liberation, then, was not a single story. For the Allied prisoner, it was a dramatic, last-minute rescue from the brink of biological extinction. It was an affirmation of life, a raw and emotional return to a world they thought they would never see again. For the German prisoner, it was a far quieter and more bewildering event. It was an awakening from a strange dream of ordered, well-fed captivity into the living nightmare that their nation had become. It was the moment they finally collided with the catastrophic defeat they had been so comfortably and completely shielded from. When the passions of war have cooled, and the individual stories of suffering and survival have been told, what remains is the cold, dispassionate language of numbers. Statistics offer no room for sentiment or interpretation. They are the final, brutal ledger of outcomes. In assessing the two prison systems, the ultimate and most unforgiving metric is the mortality rate. It is the bottom line of human cost, an objective measure of the life-giving capacity of one system and the life-destroying efficiency of the other. The numbers, in their stark clarity, serve as a final judgment, rendering a verdict that is both unambiguous and eternal. The official post-war reports compiled by the Office of the Provost Marshal General of the United States Army tell a story of almost bureaucratic placidity. Of the approximately 378,000 German prisoners of war held in the continental United States, the total number of deaths recorded was 2,222. This represents an overall mortality rate of just 0.58%. When these figures are broken down, the story becomes even more astonishing. The leading causes of death were not disease or malnutrition, but incidents unrelated to the camp conditions themselves. Suicides, often committed by fanatical Nazis upon learning of Germany's final defeat, accounted for a significant portion. Another large category was accidents, particularly among prisoners engaged in labor contracts on farms or in logging operations. A small number died from pre-existing medical conditions, such as heart ailments, that would have been fatal in any environment. The number of deaths attributable to neglect, abuse, or starvation is statistically zero. The American system, for all its occasional flaws, was so effective at preserving life that a German soldier's chances of survival were, ironically, significantly higher as a prisoner in America than they would have been had he remained in combat on the Eastern Front. The statistical record for the Allied prisoners of the Japanese is a document of almost unimaginable horror. The findings of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, commonly known as the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, compiled data from every theater of the Pacific War. The numbers vary slightly depending on the nationality, but the overall picture is one of catastrophic loss of life. Of the approximately 132,000 Western Allied prisoners of war, including Americans, British, Australians, Dutch, and Canadians, an estimated 35,756 died in captivity. This represents a staggering overall mortality rate of 27.1%. This number, already horrific, contains within it pockets of even greater lethality. For the men forced to work on the Burma-Thailand Railway, the Death Railway, the rate approached 30%. On the infamous hell ships used to transport prisoners, where men were packed into airless holds with no food or water, the mortality rate could exceed 50% on a single voyage. These were not accidental deaths. They were the direct result of a system that combined forced labor, medical neglect, and near-total starvation into an efficient engine of human destruction. The final statistical hammer falls when these two numbers are placed side by side. For German prisoners in American hands, the mortality rate was less than 1%. For Allied prisoners in Japanese hands, it was over 27%. This is not a simple comparison. It is a chasm of experience. It means that if you were a German soldier captured by the Americans, your odds of seeing your home again were better than 99%. If you were an American soldier captured by the Japanese, your odds of survival had dropped to less than 73%. To state it in the most direct human terms, more than 1 in every 4 Allied prisoners of the Japanese died. They did not die in battle. They died of preventable diseases, of treatable wounds, and most of all, of simple, prolonged starvation, months or even years after their capture. Meanwhile, in the United States, a system of such overwhelming efficiency was in place that it could house a population the size of Pittsburgh, composed entirely of its enemies, and lose almost none of them to the hardships of captivity. These numbers are the final, indelible epitaph for the two systems. They are the mathematical proof of the consequences of two opposing worldviews. One system, founded on the cold logic of international law and powered by an unmatched industrial base, saw the preservation of its prisoners' lives as a legal and pragmatic duty. The other, built on an ideology of racial supremacy and a doctrinal contempt for surrender, viewed its prisoners as subhuman burdens, their deaths a matter of complete indifference. The statistical reckoning leaves no room for debate or moral ambiguity. It is the final, silent, and devastating testimony of the tens of thousands who never came home. With the unconditional surrender of Japan in August 1945, the war of bullets and bombs ended, and a new kind of war began. This was a war of jurisprudence, fought not in jungle trenches but in a starched, formal courtroom in Tokyo. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East was convened to answer a question of profound historical and legal significance. Were the horrors of the Japanese prison camps the tragic but unavoidable consequence of a nation collapsing under the weight of war, or were they the result of a deliberate, criminal conspiracy for which the nation's highest leaders could be held accountable? This was more than a trial. It was the formal, legal autopsy of the system that had produced the 600-calorie diet, and its verdict would attempt to redefine the very nature of responsibility in modern warfare. The central legal weapon wielded by the prosecution was a revolutionary and controversial doctrine, command responsibility. The chief prosecutor, an American lawyer named Joseph B. Keenan, argued that the men in the dock generals, cabinet ministers, and prime ministers like Hideki Tojo were guilty not because they had personally starved or beaten a prisoner, but because they had created, sanctioned, and presided over a system where such atrocities were not just possible, but inevitable. Keenan's prosecution team presented a mountain of evidence: the secret diaries of prisoners, the harrowing testimony of survivors, the clinical reports of liberating doctors, and the Japanese military's own documents, including the fateful Senjinkun. The argument was simple and devastating. A pattern of abuse so widespread, so consistent across every theatre of the war, could not be the work of a few rogue sadists. It had to be the result of a national policy, an unwritten but universally understood directive from the top. Keenan argued that a commander has an affirmative duty to ensure the welfare of those in his charge, including prisoners. A failure to act in the face of widespread, documented atrocities was not mere negligence, it was a criminal act of omission. Tojo could not claim he didn't know. As both Prime Minister and Army Minister, it was his job to know, and his responsibility to stop it. The defense presented by the accused often rested on two pillars: logistical failure and cultural difference. Lieutenant General Hong Saik, who commanded all prison camps in the Philippines during a period of catastrophic death rates, became a key test case. His defense argued that the American submarine blockade had so crippled the Japanese supply lines that it was impossible to adequately feed even his own troops, let alone the tens of thousands of prisoners under his command. He was, his lawyers claimed, a victim of circumstance, not a perpetrator of policy. Other defendants alluded to the Japanese military's unique code of honor, suggesting that the Western concept of surrender was so alien that they could not be expected to abide by the Western laws designed to protect it. The tribunal systematically rejected these arguments. They ruled that logistical difficulty, however severe, did not grant a commander a license to allow mass starvation. The judges affirmed that a commander had a duty to, at the very least, provide prisoners with rations equal to those of his own troops, however meagre. The defense of cultural difference was dismissed as an irrelevant and self-serving justification for brutality. The verdict was clear. The standards of humane treatment were universal, and the responsibility to uphold them was absolute. Hong Sa-ik was found guilty and hanged. The legal reckoning extended far beyond the high-profile trial of the 28 Class A war criminals in Tokyo. Across Asia, from Singapore to Manila, hundreds of separate military tribunals were convened to try Class B and Class C criminals. These were the men who had carried out the policy on the ground, the camp commandants, the guards, the Kempeitai officers. Here, the crimes were specific and personal. The beating of a prisoner for stealing a potato, the execution of a captured airman, the deliberate withholding of Red Cross medical supplies. Over 5,700 Japanese personnel were indicted in these trials, and over 900 were executed. This vast legal undertaking stands in stark and total contrast to the aftermath of the American POW system. In the United States, there were no war crimes trials. There were no commissions to investigate systemic abuse. There was no need. The system, from its conception, had been designed to operate within the bounds of the Geneva Convention. Its every action was documented, inspected, and legally justified. The paper trail that proved the American system's compliance was as vast as the one that condemned the Japanese system for its criminality. The lack of trials was not an oversight. It was a testament to a system that, for all its imperfections, had successfully adhered to the rule of law. In the end, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal and its associated trials were more than an act of victor's justice. They were the legal codification of the entire conflict over prisoner treatment. They took the statistical reality of the mortality rates and translated it into a set of legal precedents. The principle of command responsibility, forged in that courtroom, became a cornerstone of modern international law, a warning to all future leaders that they could be held accountable for the suffering of those held in their name. The trials formally declared that the treatment of prisoners of war is not a matter of cultural interpretation or logistical convenience. It is a binding, universal obligation, and its violation is not a regrettable tragedy, but a crime for which men will be tried and punished. The legal aftermath was the final, indelible line drawn between the two opposing worlds of captivity. We began with 2 plates, 2 meals served half a world apart, representing 2 irreconcilable philosophies of war. One was a testament to law, logistics, and a belief in universal standards of conduct. The other was the product of an ideology that held surrender in contempt and, by extension, saw its prisoners as less than human. The story of these 2 rations is the story of the entire war in miniature, a conflict fought not just over territory, but over the very definition of humanity. The legacy of that conflict, the hard-won lessons paid for in starvation and suffering, did not end with the liberation of the camps. It echoed for decades in the lives of the survivors and, most importantly, was permanently etched into the laws that govern the nations of the world today. For the Allied survivors of the Japanese camps, the war did not end in 1945. They carried it home inside their own bodies. The long-term health consequences of severe, prolonged malnutrition were devastating. Many men suffered from chronic gastrointestinal problems for the rest of their lives. The damage to their nervous systems from dry beriberi resulted in permanent pain and partial paralysis. The psychological scars were just as deep, with many survivors battling what would today be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. Organizations like the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor were formed not just for remembrance, but for advocacy. For decades they fought a grueling battle for recognition from their own government and for reparations from Japan. Their fight was a constant reminder to the world of what had happened, a living testimony against any attempt to forget or minimize the horrors of the camps. Their continued suffering was the enduring human cost of the 600-calorie diet, a debt that lingered long after the war was over. For the German prisoners repatriated from the United States, the legacy of their captivity was of a profoundly different and more complex nature. They returned not to a victory parade, but to a nation in ruins, morally and physically shattered. Yet, their experience in America had planted an unexpected seed. They had witnessed, firsthand, a system that operated on principles of law, order, and a strange, impersonal fairness, even toward its enemies. They had seen a democracy, for all its flaws, that was capable of immense organization and possessed a staggering material abundance. This stood in shocking contrast to the chaotic, nihilistic, and ultimately self-destructive reality of the Nazi regime they had served. As Germany was rebuilt, particularly in the West, these former prisoners became a crucial, if often overlooked, part of the process. They were a generation of men who had been involuntarily exposed to a different model of society. While it is impossible to quantify, their experience undoubtedly contributed to the post-war German public's widespread rejection of totalitarianism and its embrace of the democratic and legal structures that would define the new Federal Republic. The 4,000-calorie diet had done more than just sustain their bodies. It had provided a powerful, undeniable lesson in the functioning of a lawful state. The most significant and enduring legacy of the entire POW experience was forged, once again, in the halls of Geneva. In 1949, galvanized by the horrors of the Second World War, the nations of the world came together to revise and radically expand the laws of war. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 were a direct response to the failures and atrocities that had been exposed. The Third Geneva Convention, relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, was a massive reinforcement of the 1929 treaty. It clarified ambiguities, closed loopholes, and explicitly outlawed the kind of systemic abuse and neglect that had characterized the Japanese camps. It strengthened the principle of command responsibility, making it unequivocally clear that leaders would be held accountable. And, critically, the Fourth Geneva Convention was created, for the first time extending protections to civilians in wartime. The lessons learned from the Pacific, the death marches, the starvation diets, the murder of prisoners were translated directly into the binding articles of international humanitarian law. Thus, we return to the two plates. The memory of that 600-calorie bowl of watery gruel and the tens of thousands of lives it extinguished is now a permanent warning, enshrined in the legal architecture of the modern world. The precedent of the 4,000-calorie meal, a demonstration that it is possible for a nation to fight a total war without abandoning its commitment to the rule of law, serves as the standard to which all are now held. The contrast between them is no longer just a historical anecdote. It is the foundation of the laws that strive to impose a measure of humanity on the inhumanity of war. It is the hard-won, permanent lesson that the true measure of a nation's civilization is not how it treats its friends, but how it treats the enemies it holds in its absolute power.